Hello everyone, and welcome to Getters, Setters, and Raising Exceptions. Pretty exciting name, isn't it? In this video, we're going to continue our conversation on encapsulation, okay? But we're going to talk about these concepts called getters and setters that you see a lot in object-oriented development, okay? Not that you have to use them, not that they're there all the time, but there are kind of a neat way of providing protection against a variable, I guess I should say. So it basically lends itself toward encapsulation. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about what it looks like in VB, so you can at least get an idea. Matter of fact, it helps to define VB a little bit to make sure you probably understand how it is in Python. We'll get into Python. Once again, these things are pretty simple, all in all. And then finally, we're going to talk about raising an exception in your class, okay? And what that means and how it kind of relates to these getters and setters, okay? So let's get started. What are a getter and a setter? Well, a getter and a setters are unique methods in a class used to effectively protect your data. For each variable, a getter method returns its value, while a setter method sets or updates its value. Getters and setters are also called assessors, mutators, respectively. So I don't know if I'm going to call them assessors or mutators, but you might see those concepts out there when you get into it. So what are we saying here? Well, once again, what we're kind of saying is that if you think about encapsulation, and maybe in a sense what you want to do is that you want to make variables, input variables, available to your uh, application programmer, but you want to make sure, in a sense, that the data they provide to those variables, even though we're not truly encapsulating them, is valid. Okay, so how would we actually do that? So, because if I just set up an instant variable and say, okay, this is now equal to that instant variable, it's going to be. And if you think about Python, there is no data type, so it basically just takes on the data type that you give it. Well, that might be a bad thing, right? Especially if you're going to add with that data type and they provide you a string or a bunch of alphanumeric characters. So what do we do to, in a sense, encapsulate those variables and make sure that that whatever our application programmer provides that variable, the data provides it, is actually valid in the sense of what the class developer intended for it to be. So basically, a getter and setter is an opportunity to actually do validation. It's actually that simple. Okay? These methods can be used in object-oriented programming, and like I said before, it's keeping up with the principle of encapsulation, all right? And so what am I talking about? I got my new little slide here once again, we're class developers and we got application programmers, and these are my users who offer the application programmers. But basically what we're saying is my application programmers instantiates a class, say like class one, and then he wants to utilize and send data to that class or set data in this class to actually get some things done, right? That's basically the inputs. What we're basically saying here is we're going to build a little bit of a wall, if you can imagine, a little bit of a wall between it that, okay, if you set it, that's fine, but then I'm going to validate it first. And that's what we're going to do. What's kind of cool about this is that the application programmer don't have to call these methods for validations. My class will take care of that itself. And that's what we're going to get into. All right? Does that make sense? The methods are pretty powerful that the application developer, just like I said a second ago, does not have to call them. So they physically don't have to call a method to validate the data in which you're actually putting in. The class will take care of it itself. That's what a getter and setter is for. They will automatically run when the application programmer tries to set the variable in their program or get a variable contents in their program. That's pretty much what we're saying here, okay? Like stated before, these methods aid in the principle of encapsulation in that the application programmer simply can't set a variable on their own. It would first need to go through a method that the class developer has created to ensure that it's correct and valid. So we're basically building some validation type of code in our class, just like we built validation code in our application programmer for when the users inputted bad data. It's just the same concept. If we're going to utilize a class and reuse different pieces, if my class developer is going to ensure or can ensure that the data that's coming into the class is valid so it actually works and not abnormally ends. That's all it is. Okay? Do you have to do this? Once again, you don't have to do anything. But if you're a class developer and you feel it's very important to ensure that the data coming into your class and coming into that method meets certain criteria, the answer is absolutely you should do it. Okay? If you feel that your application programmer might have already validated based upon the user inputting data, maybe you don't. So it's all based upon the design, the upfront design that your enterprise is going to do on these classes. But once again, these types of things, like I mentioned in my previous video, are all optional and things that you can do to enhance and make your class that much more effective potentially. Okay? The goal of all of this is that you understand the concepts. I'm going into VB now, getters and setters in VB. I want you to make sure you understand a little bit of the concepts in other languages so you can apply them when you're learning other languages, okay? Python is its own little world. You've seen that so far in regards to what we have covered so far in this class and what we have also covered in regards to object-oriented in Python. And so I want you to kind of see what Visual Basic looks like. So let's go ahead and do so. Once again, what I did is I provided you this this link. Okay, you can use this from the PowerPoint or all these links that I make available in all my videos, plus more, are part of the resources of each additional week. And I welcome you and I actually encourage you to click on those resources to continue your learning or maybe aid in your understanding. All right, so we're going to go ahead on out of this for a second. I already got this up for us. And we'll look at how we create in Visual Basic. Visual Basic, for the most part, and really in any language, what we're talking about here is that if you remember what an object-oriented, if you go back to Visual Basic, let's go back to your GUI times in Visual Basic. You remember we had these things when we brought a control over to our form, like a button, right? Let's do a text box. That's a little bit easier. So we brought a text box over, and if you recall, there were a couple different things you can do that our text box had, right? It had properties and it had methods. Well, properties are the data, methods are the behaviors. And so in Visual Studio, what we're basically doing is that when you create a property, there's a couple different ways of creating a property. One, just declaring the variable as public. That's actually a property when it comes to logical type of class development like we're doing right now. Another way to do it in Visual Studio is you can kind of create a property overall. Let me kind of show you some of this code. I'm not going to go through it. I welcome you to read this though. I really do, to base your understanding. And so what we're basically doing here is we're creating a property called full name. All right. Now, up here, I could have created it. I have some dims as first name, last name, but I could have made just full name as string and make it public, and you could just enter it in there. What we're doing is we've been a little more thorough. What we're going to do is create a property. And when you do this in Visual Basic, when you create the property, it automatically creates what's called a get and what's called a set. And so basically what's going to happen is when your application developer says full name equals Bob Niels, okay, which he can do. He basically instantiate the class. Let's just say that's a person class, okay? Person dot full name equals Bob Niels. This will actually get the information, and then the setter, in a sense, basically takes that information, okay? And what they will do is it will basically take that information, and in this case, in a sense, validate it. Let's look what this particular setter is doing. It's taking this information, okay, trying to find the space, okay, the value of space, okay. I'm sorry, it declared a variable here called space, and it's basically going to be equal to the index of, remember that from the programming 2, hopefully you're getting into that or you've already gotten into it. So it's actually going to tell the index where that space resides. In this case here, it's going to say if space is less than 0, meaning -1 is what it returns an index of, right? If it can't find it, there was no first name, and so thus, I'm sorry, there was no last name, so thus the last name is spaces, and the first name is going to be the value of what we actually brought into this. Does that make any sense at all? So this setter is going to take full name, Bob Niels. It's going to say, where's the space at? Well, we actually was a space. So it'd be in 0, 1, 2, the third index, correct? Hopefully you're at that point in programming too, and that makes you understand that. And so being the third index, and so what it's going to do is if it couldn't find a space, it's going to assume there was no last name. But if it does find a space, meaning it's greater than 0, it's going to use that substring function, right? And actually take from 0 to wherever the space was to get the first name, and then wherever the space was plus 1, because we're basically getting past the space and taking the rest of it as its last name. I wasn't really intended to teach you string manipulation techniques. Hopefully you look at this and you already know what these are and it makes sense, regardless if it makes sense or not. The whole thing we're trying to accomplish in this is that we can build a property that has some validation or even logic to it to break things apart, to make things are valid, and so on. I have used most setters as validation, making sure that the data meets certain criteria. If I'm bringing in a number, or I'm having them set a number, I want to make sure it's greater than this. I want to make sure it's numeric and those types of things. That's a nice thing to do in the setter type piece here. And so when you define a property in Visual Studio, like I said, there's two ways of doing it. Public first name, public last name, potentially. That's a property. It has no validation rules and so on. Or we can guard those properties a little bit more, create a property, and make sure it's all working correctly and it's all valid. Does that make sense? Okay. And so again, this is Visual Basic. Okay. You actually type in the word property into it, the name, and automatically when you do that, the get and set functions or methods automatically pop up for you in Visual Studio. Kind of neat, right? Of course, this is not how Python does it, but they can do the same thing. We can actually make sure that we can create a property, and we can, in a sense, guard that property by making sure we do something to the actual data that's being passed to the property, like full name, prior to actually working with it. So again, what this basically property is doing is it's determining if you bring a name in, is it a full name or just the first name? And if it is, it's going to set these particular properties, these particular variables that they might be using later on in their class. Hopefully that makes sense. Once again, please, even though I'm referencing this, I'm not going to sit here and read this to you in a video, but please read this stuff. Hopefully it will aid in your understanding, okay? So that's kind of what it looks like in Visual Basic, okay? That you basically can find a whole property with a get and set. Pretty slick, right? In Python, obviously it's a little bit different, okay? Python, I provided you this link, and once again, that link, if we go back to this, is available to you on the PowerPoint presentation and also available to you in the resources. Things are a little different when it comes to Python. Not much, actually. It's actually kind of simple. And again, in that case, where am I here? There you go. And I'm not going to read this entire piece to you, but once again, I highly recommend you read it yourself. This particular write-up is on the Python course, okay, that I found for us. It does a really nice job with the getters and setters. Getters and setters aren't overly popular in Python, but you can make them, and they're there. And the reason I'm bringing them up in this particular course, because you definitely see them in other languages, so I want to make you aware of them. So they kind of walk you through and build up to what it is we're actually going to end up with. And I highly recommend that you read that. For the most part, I've already described quite a bit of this. But in the end, what you really end up with is this right here. That our property, in this case, when we're looking at Python and we're defining a property, maybe in this case X, okay? I'm going to rename this and show you this a little bit differently. But X, we literally can define my getters and setters right here. To do so, it's an ampersand property and it's an ampersand X setter. And we're going to do that in front of the header of the particular method. Okay, header being this right here. Okay, that's a header. And this is a header. These little guys right here, okay, these ampersand property and ampersand the name of whatever the header is, or the property is, dot setter, are what's called decorators, okay? And ampersand property, for the most part, is a decorator. And then this particular piece right here is the getter side of it. And this particular piece right here is the setter side of it. And, as you can see in this case, what it's doing is taking X in. Everything is cool here. You got to have both to make this work. You got to have both to make it work. You got to have a property and a setter, okay? And then what you need to do, if you actually look at this, what this is actually doing is checking to see what X was that was passed in. If it was less than 0, it's going to make the X property, the in this case, what am I thinking of? Instant variable X. I hate that they use X for everything, but the instant variable X is going to be 0. And then if X is greater than 1,000, the instant variable is going to be 1,000. Okay, so if you gave it 5,000, it would bring it back to 1,000. So again, just some stupid code to kind of give you an example of what's going on in that case. And if we ran this, everything would work very nicely. Okay. Kind of cool. Does that make sense? So a getter and a setter in Python, how you write it is you use these little pieces that if I want to define a property, I use a decorator, it's called, with a little ampersand in front of it, called ampersand property. This would be the getter. This would be the setter. And once again, what you're going to do as you practice, I use this more for validation. And so if I just want to simply set the thing, set my instant variable like we've been doing up to this point, and we don't care about validation and we're good with whatever they give us, okay, great, that's fine. You don't need this ampersand property. You don't need this ampersand etc. Again, it's not etc. It's the name of the property itself, okay, in there. So, but if you feel like, wait a minute, in my class, I want to make sure that whatever they pass to us meets certain criteria, meets validation pieces, that is what you would do. You would actually add this getter and setter to it to automatically run when they try to set the property. All right, let's take you out to some code. And what I basically did here was mimic the code that we just saw on that particular website. However, I gave it a little bit better naming convention so we don't deal with P and X and all this kind of stuff. And so if we sit back and kind of look at this, what we're basically doing is I have a class, I just called it example. Not a great name for a class, but whatever, that's what we're doing. We're doing an example in this case, okay? And so I'm going to receive int number as input. Okay, so it's going to be passed to me as input in my constructor there. I automatically take this int number, I'm going to set it to my instant variable called int number. All right. With that said, what's going to happen is because we define the property of int number here and my setter int number here, this defines the property. Okay, they don't have to be right on top of each other. They just got to be a pair. Okay, in this case. And if you actually look at it, I also have one for number 2, which is a different variable. Okay, and so I defined a new variable called int number 2. I'm not passing to it through a constructor, but I can set it. It's going to be available to me in my as part of my properties available. But once again, it's going to go through some validation, and that's what I'm doing here. And so what this particular piece is going to do, int number. I have my getter right here, and then my setter is going to make sure that if it's less than 0, we're going to talk about raising exceptions here in about 1 second. Okay, I'm going to raise an exception saying it's not good. If it's greater than 0 and it's greater than 1,000, I'm going to go ahead and set the number to 1,000. So if you pass me 5,000, I'm going to make it 1,000. If it's not greater than 1,000, it's somewhere between 1 and 999, I guess, or 1 and 1,000, I should say. It's just going to keep that data as it is. Again, some stupid code, really not relevant here, but what you can do is write any kind of validation code that you would like in that setter that's basically blocking, not blocking, but basically protecting that particular property. Does that make sense? Okay, so getters and setters are basically define a property in which you can very easily make sure that before an application programmer sets a property, that it will automatically go through these methods for you. And if it's bad, it will say so. So in this sense right here, if I run this, you will actually see it through an exception called int number should not exceed 5. Okay, where did it get that? Right here. I have int number as -12 in my testing, and that's basically what happened. Let's go back to the PowerPoint here, and we'll kind of come back and bring this all together. Okay, and let's see. I'm going to get down to raising an exception here as we kind of walk back through. Okay. So I introduced this whole idea of raise an exception. So when it comes to setters, the goal again is to ensure that the data that is being set in the class is correct. In other words, it is valid. Just like you do when you validate your input in your application program from a user. A class developer can do the exact same thing. But what we can do instead of doing messagebox.shows like you did previously, or prints and so on, in a class, you have to actually raise an exception. Okay, the goal would be is that the application programmer who's testing this class, it will abnormally end when he's doing so. And so then the application programmer will know that he needs to make sure that only good data can get into this class. So in a lot of cases, it's almost like testing. Okay, when you raise an exception, it's not something that a user should ever see, but an application programmer should see in their testing of their application to ensure they're using the class correctly. All right? Once again, let me state that again. When you raise an exception in a class, it's not something that a user will see. Okay? User meaning the user of the application program that's being written for them. This is something that's only going to be seen in the testing of the application by the application developer before they actually make it public to the users. But this is the thing that so what they're going to do is test, and if all of a sudden exceptions are thrown, they're going to ensure their application program, they need to fix their application program, so that should never happen. You never want to get an exception, right? If you think about an exception that you may have already gotten when you try to add two alphanumeric characters together, or maybe an exception you got if you went out of bounds of an array, those types of things. I'm sure all of you have seen those so far. In the end, we never want those to go public to our users. Whew, I hope that makes sense. I know that. If not, go back and listen to what I just said one more time. And so what we're doing when we raise an exception in a class, it's not like a message box. It's basically a saying that my class requires this data to be like this, Mr. Application Programmer. You must send me good data, or you must ensure that you always send me good data. And so rewrite your program to make sure that happens. All right? So how do you raise an exception? There's a lot of different variations. I'm going to show you the simplest one. I just keep it simple right now. It can get a little bit more complex if you like. There's a book that's tied to this course. I recommend you go out and look at it. There's a whole chapter on raising exceptions. And there's a lot of things out on Google. If you can't find the book, or the book's not available for this particular course at this particular time, but for the most part, go look at it. Okay, you'll see all kinds of different variations out there, but it's actually pretty simple. And I actually kind of showed you that a second ago. So let's go back out and look at this one more time and try to explain it again. And so what we are is I'm a class developer. As I'm developing this class called example. All right. And in this example, I'm going to be able to, I have two properties that I have defined. One is the int number, and another was int number 2. Okay. At any point in time when I test this, okay, I can actually I can set those properties two ways. Okay, the one way, because I have it part of my my constructor, is it can be passed in when I instantiate my object. Correct. The other way, I can just have a brand new property now, because like number 2 here, and I can very easily just set it very simply, just like this. Example 2, that's from this object right here, .int2 equal 3. Both times, if I set it this way, 1001, or if I set it this way with -12, or I set it this way with 3, it's going to go through the setter method and ensure that it's valid. And if it is, it will then set it correctly in my program, and then it could be used in other methods or whatever it is we're going to be using those particular variables aka properties for. All right, so once again, let's play with this a little bit. My first one here is I had 1,000. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this out, and we're just going to test it right off the bat. We're going to go ahead and instantiate example, not the class example, and make the object example 1, and we're going to pass in 1001, okay? By me passing in 1001, it's going to automatically run this setter, and what should happen is my numbers should end up being 1000 once I print it. Let's see if I'm right. Holding my breath, yay, there it is. I printed it off. It took that 1001 and changed it to 1000. It automatically did that. The power you should see in this is that we didn't have to call the setter itself. It automatically did it just by trying to set the property. That's powerful, right? Hopefully you see that. All right, let's go to the next ones here. I'll go ahead and tell you what I'll do. I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to take this out for a second, and then I'm going to cut this too, and we'll just do this next one. In this case here, it's going to be a negative 12. And I'm doing that with, I'm setting another object called example2 from my class. And I'm going to set that number to negative 12. What should happen here is negative 12, it's less than 0. It's going to throw an exception. And there it did. It actually threw an exception. It abnormally ended the program. That's what throwing an exception means. As a developer then, an application developer, I'm going to have to make sure that that never happens. Okay, so I need to make sure that maybe I need to build validation code on my end to make sure that the user doesn't provide the wrong numbers, or I just need to modify my program to ensure that I don't use this class with a negative number. Does that make sense? Again, it's not a messagebox.show. Remember that, and raising an exception is not something a user should see ever, because we never want to abnormally end your programs. This is for testing, to tell the application programmer, make sure you send me the right data during your testing, and make sure you always do it when it's ready to go live to your users. All right, and so if I went in there and fixed this up a little bit, let's see, if I went in here and took that negative off, I would believe my answer is going to be 12. And there it is. My answer is 12 because it wasn't greater than 1,000, but it was greater than 0. Cool? Pretty simple. This code will be available to you. Kind of take a look at it and kind of go from there. And my last one we did was, in this case, instead of instantiating, whoops, let's see. Let me go back to that. I messed up. We'll just do it this way. And this is going to be number 2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to I'll do example 2. There it is, example 2 is equal to example. That's the name of my class. And I'll go ahead and pass in that 12 again. Okay. So I instantiated example 2. But now what I can do, 12 is going to set int number. I should have called that int number 1, but you get the idea. But I can also set int number 2. And with 3. So in this case here, that number 2 setter, once I set this thing, it's going to validate it and say, nope, if it's less than 20, we got issues. Let's see what happens. Is it going to abnormally end on me? Oh, I probably have to look at that a little bit more. Something happened there, but what should basically happen, I'm looking at my code to make sure, I guess I should have tested it, but in this case here, let's see, let me make sure I got everything correct. I think I do. And so this would abnormally end. So I'm going to end this on a little bit of a quirk, but I don't want to redo this whole video again for you. But nonetheless, the concepts are there that should actually abnormally end itself and go from there, and make sure that our data in this case is perfect. Okay, basically greater than 20. All right. That's how you can do this. So I recommend you kind of play around with it, and that's how you get these getters and setters to actually work. All right, so let's go back out to our piece here, and yep, we looked at the code together, and so that's what it is. Okay, a getter and setter is part of encapsulation. It basically builds the property out to ensure that the property in itself has validation around it, or whatever it is you want to do with it, like you saw that one example where it just split up first name on the VB side. You can do anything you want to do based upon the logic and based upon the design of your class. All right, hope that makes sense to you. Good luck with that.